As many of you know, I spent 4 years serving a wonderful congregation in the upper Midwest prior to my arrival with this equally yet differently wonderful congregation. I truly enjoyed my time in that region and came to love the people in my congregation and the wider community. Now, if you're from the Midwest or have spent significant time in that region, you will, I think, appreciate and perhaps even identify with this. In the Midwest, humility is a core value. Hyperbolic compliments are not commonplace, as most statements are made with a sense of reasonableness, if not understatement. This is a tendency that I picked up in my relatively short time in the region, as when paid a compliment, I will often reframe it more judiciously, even when it's about my partner or child or dog, of whom I think the world. An example might be something like this: someone telling me that Thomas is a great kid, to which I will usually respond, "Yeah, he's not too bad." Early on in my time in Moorhead, before I had figured all this out, I preached a sermon on the dangers of pride, and the congregation to a person simply nodded along, as if to say, "Yeah, tell us something we don't know." So with the tagline we find at the end of our passage this morning, "All who exalt themselves will be humbled, and all who are humble themselves will be exalted," I find myself imagining what that congregation would do. In my head, it goes something like this: yes. As an aside, given that the World Series just ended, I did consider making some sort of comment about the grand reversal of which Jesus speaks, offering a sense of hope to even this diehard Padre fan. But then I realized that humility and futility are two different things. Anyway, these days, I find myself serving a congregation with a slightly different approach to things, and one that I have come to love for different reasons. We are, after all, a church with a very active theater ministry and a particularly showy choir program, and a tendency to put on what Mr. Ed Sullivan might call a really big shoe. There are many among us that would not shy away from the spotlight, yours truly among them. If I am honest, I did agree to be the king in the Renaissance feast. And my experience is that while we don't completely lack humility, we do know how to take a compliment as well as dole them out. I wonder then how we might hear the message of Jesus this morning. Once again, we find Jesus taking on some from among the religious establishment of his time, the Pharisees. We will recall that by the time the writer of Matthew's gospel is doing his writing, the temple in Jerusalem is gone. And the Pharisees represent the true establishment for Judaism, a sect with whom the writer is none too pleased. So the consistent portrayal of the Pharisees as the foil to Jesus' hero makes a lot of sense. In this particular passage, Jesus falls short of calling them out as hypocrites and characterizing them as a den of vipers, as he has done previously, but the sentiment is no less damning, as Jesus offers the classic instruction, essentially, do as they say, not as they do. He then harkens back to the instructions he gave at the very beginning of his ministry in the Sermon on the Mount, when he describes the proper way to pray, to give alms, even to fast. In each case, he warned against making a big show of it, preferring instead a more private, subtle observance. Humility in the practice of our faith, from the very beginning of Jesus' message, was to be a guiding value. Jesus is reminding us time and again of how we are to be humble before God, as we acknowledge that God is God, and Jesus is calling into question misplaced pride in how we live out our relationship with God. Jesus is not, however, condemning pride universally. It is important to note that he is also not suggesting we should in any way be overly prideful to the point of arrogance, but we will recall that Paul reminds us that each of us is blessed by God with talents, and we are meant to share those gifts, not hide them or keep them to ourselves. Further, Jesus taught us that the greatest commandment is threefold: to love God, to love neighbor, and to love self. Such a commandment expects of us a strong sense of self-love, just not out of balance with the love we have for our neighbors, and always in relationship with our love of God. So I might be so bold to suggest that Jesus would celebrate the ministries we have at this church that provide space to share our talents. And I might imagine Jesus standing alongside the rest of us as we applaud the actors on the stage after a wonderful performance of Rainmaker, or the singers in period costume taking part in a rousing Renaissance feast. For in these settings, the spotlight is appropriate, to be sure. But there is a difference between what we do down there in the theater and up here in the sanctuary on a Sunday morning. For that is entertainment, and this is worship. In this space, we might choose instead to shun the spotlight, remembering that the focus of our time, even as individuals, is not solely on the I, but as much or more on the community of faith, as well as those outside the community who need our assistance. We were reminded that in our observance of the sacrament of communion, in which we will take part this morning. This is a foundational celebration of our Christian faith, and one that recognizes the centrality of community to that faith. It's not about me, it's about us. And this particular Sunday, when as part of that sacrament we will observe All Saints Sunday, that understanding of us reaches back to the saints of our past and forward to the saints that are still to come. But there is more for us in Jesus' message this morning. This warning to not allow ourselves to puff ourselves up about our faith is, in my opinion, a cautionary statement for our time. As we mentioned last Sunday, this past Tuesday was the 500th anniversary of the Protestant Reformation. There is much to celebrate with this occasion as we recognize the beauty of a focus on God's grace and the invitation that represents to participate in the sweeping forgiveness that God offers. But in the past 5 centuries, we have also witnessed something not so wonderful, as time and again the Christian church has divided. This past Sunday, we heard a bit about the phenomena of division in our culture, as our wise and insightful youth reminded us that diversity need not be something to be feared, but to be celebrated. That distinction can be applied just as easily to the division that results in a diversity of opinion, social, political, and theological. The difficulty arises on the theological front when we cling so tightly to our truth over and against others' beliefs. In such cases where diversity is a threat, we may be prone to take a stand similar to the caricatured Pharisees in Jesus' story, exalting ourselves and our perspective over those of others. We may forget the humility Jesus is encouraging, believing that our views or our brand of Christianity is somehow better or correct, and we may discount or negate the faithfulness of others. At such times, we would be wise to remember Jesus' warning that all who exalt themselves will be humbled. We might recognize that God and the worship of God is much larger and expansive than just our view might suggest. Besides, if we believe that God is still speaking, we ought to keep on listening wherever and however God speaks. My friends, it is a great and wonderful gift to find a theological home and to find a community with which you share values. We remain dedicated to offering an extravagant welcome to all who come through our doors, and we rejoice at their arrival. Yet, let us always maintain a sense of humility in our faith. And let us celebrate all of God's children as they, too, find their place, be it here among the saints of Manhattan Beach Community Church or among the saints in another faith community, another faithful expression of God in this world. Amen.